Hello fellow Tarnished. This video you're about to watch is about Elden Ring and Shadow of the Erdtree level design. I will show and discuss a lot of different environments from the game. The discovery of those environments was a great part of my enjoyment of the game, so if you haven't played Elden Ring, especially the DLC, you may want to skip that video to avoid spoilers. Bosses are not the main focus of the video, but I will still show a few of them, starting with the final boss of Elden Ring, so watch this video at your discretion. For me, one of the most intriguing parts of Elden Ring DLC released was not even part of the DLC, it was a tiny change to the last boss of the base game. In Elden Ring we have a spectral steed named Torrent, which I will refer to as a horse. And he is one of the best horses ever in a video game. He is super easy to summon, he can double jump, you can pick up stuff while on his back, and I found fighting the random soldiers or enemies we find in the open world on Torrent's back to be very satisfying. There is this feeling of being above them, just bashing their head with your sword. You know in movies when someone fights on horseback and it seems he is invincible? Well, I have the same kind of feeling on Torrent's back. Not that it's true, he can be knocked down pretty easily and that's bad for you, you're probably gonna die if that happens, but before he get knocked down, you had that feeling of being unstoppable. Which is probably why you end up in that situation. You were just being careless because of that feeling. And all of that makes it such a great ally. Torrent makes exploring the world of Elden Ring more enjoyable. But Torrent can't be used everywhere in Elden Ring. He cannot go in the different dungeons the game has, all those caves and catacombs and castles, and that's fine. Torrent is here for the open world. The dungeons are more about carefully exploring an intricate place with enemies threatening you, trying to ambush you, where you need to be slow and careful and where finding a new checkpoint is a relief. Things that don't go well with being on the back of a horse that make you feel powerful. I think that in a way, that moment when you enter a cave and the game takes Torrent away helps put you in the dungeon mood, like things get serious when that happens, you know? Not being allowed in the dungeon means Torrent is not allowed against the majority of the game's bosses, which is fine, because Torrent is not super good against bosses. The combat system while on horseback is severely limited from the one you have on foot. Every weapon has the same 3-hit attack, you can choose 2 weapons at the same time or use one weapon using both hands, you cannot use the weapon's special attacks, or lots of spells, or jumping attacks, there is no shield you can hide behind, and even if Torrent's sprint can look like a roll, kind of, it doesn't give you invulnerability frames, which are moments of invulnerability that you have when you do a roll, making rolling a good way of avoiding enemies' attack while sprinting is not. So basically, on the horse you feel strong, but in reality you have worse attack options and worse defense options, which is not an issue against basic enemies, but makes fighting bosses on horseback kinda suck. That doesn't mean there are no bosses you can't fight with Torrent, because there is, but most of the time it's just easier to not use him. In fact, most of the time where you can use Torrent during a boss battle, you use him to move around. Like when a dragon flies away and you jump on the horse to avoid this fire and run towards him to continue the fight. Torrent is great against the dragons, or Radan, or the fire giant, because they are enemies that move around a lot in the middle of big arenas and having the horse to dodge their attacks or get close to them is nice. Which brings us to the final boss of Elden Ring. A large enemy that moves around a lot with attacks that are really hard to avoid with the base movements of our character because we move too slowly. All of that make it sound like we should be able to use a horse for that fight, but it was not a possibility before the release of the DLC. It's not just the boss design. Another argument some people have used to say we should be able to use a horse here has to do with the game's story. At the start of the game you end up in a ditch and it's Torrent that chooses you to be the main character, so it would make sense to have him show up to help you at the end, but it wasn't. You couldn't summon Torrent against the final boss of Elden Ring. And I didn't mind not being able to summon the horse during that fight when I played the game. The boss teleporting away so you have to run for 30 seconds to get close to him and sometimes he just teleports again as you arrive. That didn't bother me for some reason, and I completely miss how having Torrent will make sense story-wise. But listening to people's arguments, I was easily convinced that yeah, having the horse would have made the fight better. So why weren't we able to summon Torrent during that fight? Well, I don't know. There has been some discussion about it. Maybe they just forgot to put torrent for the last fight and were too embarrassed to change that, which is an explanation I can't believe. They've already added a pop-up and changed someone's dialogue to point players toward the tutorial because it is so poorly placed that people keep missing it. They've also added markers on the map for some quests because they've forgotten to put any pointer to where the quest was asking you to go and players were just not finding them. Those are huge admissions they fucked up, so I don't really buy the idea they were too embarrassed to change the last boss. Maybe it was bugged and they never managed to fix it, which is another explanation people had that I can't really believe. I can't imagine the persons making the game not being able to add torrent wherever they want in the game. What I think is more probable is that they just didn't plan on having torrent for the last boss. Or they do have planned for having torrent but decided to remove him. Maybe because the gameplay with torrent was not good enough compared to what they originally planned. Or maybe because playtests showed players struggling too much against the boss with the horse available. Or maybe it was the opposite and the boss was too easy. Or maybe it's something else I cannot think about. What's important to me is that they changed their mind and decided to add the horse during the last boss when they released the DLC. I can't believe it took them 2 years to fix the game. For me, that shows they changed their mind. I think the reason the change happened with the DLC release was to give the final boss some attention, to give a reason for players who restarted the game for the DLC to not just play the DLC but also refinish the game by changing the last boss. You know, like, oh, we can have torrent for Elden Beast now, let's try it after the DLC. I am not saying this was a conspiracy and they planned that from the get-go, but more like they planned the torrent change at some point and decided it was best to wait for the DLC. But anyway, that change got me wondering, was the DLC going to be different from the base game? And like, of course it's going to be different from the base game, I know. What I mean is, I did not expect the quest to be so vague again after they had to patch them in the base game. To me, the added markers was an admission they fucked up, and I did not expect that to happen in the DLC or future games. But now they were changing the last boss, which is a big part of the game. If they are ready to change that, to acknowledge they should have done things differently for such an important moment in the game, how much will the DLC be different from the base game? My first expectation was that the DLC would be 1 or 2 zones, like the Altus Plateau and Montgelmir, or Limgrave and the Weeping Peninsula, with a big dungeon on one side, a small dungeon on the other, and some caves and catacombs in between. Basically, I was expecting more of Elden Ring. Well, that was my expectation before the release of the DLC, before the change to the final boss of Elden Ring, and I was wrong. This is what this video is about. We are going to talk about one of Elden Ring's major issues, look at the level design of Shadow of the Erdtree to see how it's different from the level design of Elden Ring in what seems to be an attempt to solve that issue, and how that leads to a game that, I think, is far more interesting. The size of Elden Ring was one of its biggest strengths, but I think it is also its biggest weakness, because of an inherent issue with every big game, the need to fill up the map with cool stuff to do. That's a very basic video game tip for you, but in order to make a game fun to play, players need to be able to do fun stuff in it. In Elden Ring, that takes the form of exploration and combat. There are encampments and wizard towers and minor Erdtree and catacombs and many other things that are placed all around the world to fill it up with things to do. There is an issue with that though. The bigger the game, the more assets you need to fill it up. But making new assets costs money and imagination. You need to think about something cool to make, and then you need to make it. And so, at some point, you will either run out of ideas, or you will run out of money to bring those ideas to video game life. This is not something specific to Elden Ring, every game can be a victim of that, and Elden Ring definitely was. One of the biggest complaints I and a lot of other people have raised over Elden Ring was its reuse of content. I'm not going to go into too much detail about it because I already did it in my last video about the game, but the key thing is, video games reuse content all the time and it's fine in most circumstances. But it can become an issue in at least 2 ways. The first is when content is just reused too much. That may sound like a yeah well duh moment, but the thing is, too much is very subjective. There are 16 catacombs in Elden Ring, and they are all very similar, taking place in the same environment, with the same enemies and the same elevator shaft. There is some variation here and there, but they all feel very close to each other in terms of ambience. That doesn't mean everyone is going to find the catacombs repetitive. Some players may be annoyed after the second one, and some may be fine with the 16. But no matter where you stand on that question, the fact is that each time you add one more catacombs to the game, more people are at risk of starting to feel bored with the content repeating itself. The other way reusing content can be an issue is when a game reuses content that feels like it should have been unique. Elden Ring does that a lot by reusing Remembrance bosses. They are big event bosses that feel like unique enemies you've slayed, but the vast majority of them are found again at the end of some side dungeon. For example, you have Astel that serves as a great boss battle at the end of Ranni's questline, and then you explore what feels like a random cave and you find another Astel, and he's even stronger with way more life and more attacks. That doesn't feel right to me. We should not have two Astel in the game, and in the case where there are two, the strongest one should be the one that drops a remembrance and gives an achievement, not the other. It's not bad by default. I found Margit being reused as Morgoth worked. It felt like Margit was the first phase and Morgoth the second one. They are both at an important moment in the game, and the strongest version is the one that drops the remembrance. What I think was shit was finding him again in the middle of a field like some random NPC. What the fuck? For real, why is he here? That makes no sense to me. That just feels wrong to have this guy that was the king and he's not dead but still attacking me. Maybe there are some lore reasons as to why he's still here, but for me, that was an encounter I think the game would have been better without. Here, the problem is not content being reused too much, but just being reused at all, which can be viewed as being reused too much, I know, but I think there is a slight distinction. Anyway, my point is not to argue how many catacombs would have been a nice number of catacombs before they start feeling repetitive, or what bosses can be reused or not. It's something very subjective. My point is that despite being subjective, the more you reuse content, the more that content is at risk of feeling repetitive to players. Elden Ring is about exploration and combat. I don't think enemies repetition is bad for combat. Games like Hades would not have worked like they did if repetition was bad for combat. But repetition is bad for exploration. The fun of exploring and finding new places doesn't work that much when the new places are other catacombs you've already found 4 looking exactly the same, with the boss at the end you've already fought 3 times. It's less exciting. At first you see a tree on the distance and you go there and find a cool boss, but then the second tree has the same boss, and the third has the same boss, and they all drop the same kind of rewards, and you stop being excited about what that tree is going to be about, because you already know. There is no surprise anymore. That's why repetition is an issue in Elden Ring, because it makes a big part of the game less interesting. But you still need to fill your game with content so it doesn't feel empty and boring. A game with a big play area doesn't have to feel repetitive, but the bigger the game, the more likely it is to feel repetitive because of the content being reused. And that's a problem that doesn't have lots of solutions. You either spend more time creating more assets for your game, or you make a smaller game. Elden Ring cost at release was €60, while the DLC was $40. But despite being 2/3 of the price, it is only 1/3 of the size. According to Adipalooza's calculations, the base game is 15 square kilometers, while the DLC is only 5 square kilometers. And that's reflected in the number of locations the game has. By location, I mean all the places on the map with an icon and a name. Elden Ring has around 200 locations, while Shadow of the Erdtree only has around 55. That's a lot less than what can be expected with that price difference. It's the same for the bosses. Elden Ring had 168 bosses, and by bosses I mean every fight against one or more enemies with a big health bar at the bottom of the screen. So this counts for 1, this also counts for 1, and this doesn't count. With that same metric, the DLC only has 43 bosses. But this is where things start to be interesting, because out of his 168 bosses, Elden Ring only has 60 truly different bosses. By that I mean bosses that don't share movesets and appearance with other bosses. So the many Erdtree avatar count for 1, Commander O'Neill and Commander Niall count for 1, every Crucible Knight counts for 1, and so on. The DLC features 25 different bosses, or even 32 if you include bosses that were already in the base game. And already you may be thinking, if there are only 43 bosses in the DLC and 32 different models and movesets, there is probably not that much repetition. And sure it is. Elden Ring has only 13 bosses that are only used once, whereas Shadow of the Erdtree has 14. And that is without counting the boss fights that are NPC invasion, or another humanoid that feel like NPC invasion, because then you have 20 one-time only bosses. And if you add the bosses that are used once in the DLC but that were present in the base game, then there are 27 bosses that you are going to find one and only one time in the DLC. For me, that shows the DLC is smaller in size not just because it's a DLC or because it costs less money than the base game, but that it's smaller by design. It would have been very easy to bump up the number of locations with some Evergel and copy and paste bosses. But instead, they've decided to keep more bosses unique. There is almost no repetition among them, and the ones that are repeated are only repeated once or twice. The main exception to that are the dragons, but I think this is a case where reused content is actually good for reasons we are going to discuss later. With this approach, I found looking for bosses to be more exciting and fun. My only disappointment regarding reused bosses was the second Dancing Lion. This is the first boss I fighted in the DLC, and it felt like a main boss with its cinematic introduction and very cool design. Finding a second one later felt like finding a second Margit in the Altus Plateau, or the second Astel. But apart from that one, when a boss was reused, it wasn't that big of a disappointment, because they weren't major bosses, and it was an exception, not the norm. And also because the world in which we find those bosses is, I think, far more interesting than the world of Elden Ring. There are a lot of ruins in Elden Ring. Mistwood Ruin, Witchbane Ruins, Caelid Waypoints Ruin, Carlen Ruins, Laskiar Ruins. Those ruins feel like the most copy and paste content of the game. You noticed how every image the wiki show for those ruins seems to be the same kind of basement entrance? That's because every ruin has the same building, arranged in a similar way you explore until you find the one with the basement entrance, where you will find a chest with some loot. Sometimes there is a boss. The enemies in the ruin are not always the same, the number of buildings can change, but overall, they all feel the same and never require you to do more than finding the building with the basement. In Elden Ring, the ruins level design is flat. Every building is at the same level and you can explore them in any order you want. The challenge is to find the one building with the basement, and you have a lot of freedom in how you explore. In the DLC, the ruins have a starting point. In the Prospect Town, you will enter the ruins here, and you then need to find this ruined home where you can jump on the roof leading to the second part of the town, a few more enemies and the treasure chest. Most ruins are designed like that in the DLC, with a path to follow, some enemies to fight, and smaller rewards in case you explore in the wrong direction. They don't feel copy and paste, they feel like a small dungeon, and that makes them so much more interesting. And that less freedom, more level design philosophy endures throughout the world. When you arrive in the Shadowland, you are greeted by the classic wonderful FromSoft view showing you the Erdtree and the Chalice aligned in a perfect way, making it feel like the Chalice is harvesting light falling off the tree. Moving the camera lets you see two other prominent locations, the mountain and the suppressing pillar. I immediately wanted to go visit the mountain. As soon as I saw it, I wanted to go and climb it, see what was on top. But I was unable to find a way to the mountain for a very long time. After beating Mesmer, which was an amazing fight, by the way, I was completely lost and unable to find most of the Shadowkeep exits. I want to blame that one stake of Marika for it. When I was exploring the Specimen Starhouse ceiling, one of those fire dudes made me fall to my death, and that message show up asking me if I wanted to respawn at Marika's stake. I obviously say yes, thank you, and just like that, I was at the end of the area just before Mesmer Chamber. I have no idea why that statue is here if not for that skip to exist, but anyway. That was a funny moment, but it fucked up my 3D perception of the place, I think, because I'm quite decent at navigating 3D space usually. But here I wasn't, and I missed most of the different connection between the keep and the rest of the map, so I decided to go back and explore the world to see if I've missed some secret path somewhere. One of the places I wanted to check was that spot of poison swamp on the map, because it felt like a place I should be able to reach. So I started exploring around and finally I found a cave leading to a poison swamp, leading to another cave and to the base of Rao's Ruin. At that point I had completely forgotten about the mountain I saw 20 hours before. I explored pretty much everything here until following that river south, and this is when the mountain popped back in my memory. Of course, the mountain is around here and the river goes in that direction, so obviously this was the way. I reached the end of the river, turned right and was introduced to one of the best looking places I ever seen in a video game. I explored it and found another crazy looking place, but I didn't find any way up towards the mountain. Despite how certain I was this was going to lead to the mountain, it wasn't. In fact, the path leading to the mountain is just next to the suppressing pillar, but I've missed the suppressing pillar? I think I've missed it because when I was leading in this direction, I went in that underway leading to a first poison swamp and many other locations, ending up to the second entrance of Mesmer Castle, and I've kinda forgot about the pillar at that point. But now that I was back into trying to find places I've missed in hope to find access to area I haven't yet reached, I was back into exploring the pillar. I'm not going to lie, it was disappointing. Apart from the view, there was nothing for me here. But just next to the pillar's grace point, there is a small path leading to an NPC screaming to get your attention. That led to an invasion, and just after, a dungeon. I explored it and found a boss who felt more like a Fury NPC invader with the katanas than a boss. I beat it after a few tries and I was expecting a teleportation point sending me back to the cave's entrance. And there was one, but next to it there was a door, and a grace, and the foot of the jagged peak. This area I was trying to reach for so long was connected to the rest of the world through a random cave dungeon. In Elden Ring, the best way to reach something you see in the distance is a relatively straight line. When there is a cliff in the way, they rarely cause more than a small detour, when you don't have a spirit springs or some rock you can drop on, allowing you to bypass it entirely. This is an approach that focuses a lot in freedom, the freedom to go wherever you want in the game. In Shadow of the Erdtree, when there is a cliff, there is no rock to help you down. There are almost no spirit spring in the DLC, and the few that are here need to be activated first, forcing you to access them from the right direction. Things you see just next to you may ask you to explore half the map in order to be reached. Sometimes they are locked behind the exploration of a town, or a mine, or catacombs. That's an approach that is less about freedom. You are far more constrained into how you can move throughout the world. But that makes exploration far more interesting. The more I think about it, the more I realize Elden Ring was a lot more about wandering in the open world than it was about exploring it. I was going from one location to the next in order to find loot and experience without any more thought. I didn't have to engage with the layout of the world that much. The only places where I was exploring were the dungeon, especially the Legacy dungeon, because of their intricate structure forcing me to pay attention and think about the level design of the place. Not in a video game analysis kind of way, but just in a I need to have a 3D representation of that place in my head or I will be lost kind of way. In the DLC, I was exploring in the open world. I had to pay attention to my surroundings, to look at the map, trying to figure out the places I haven't been and where I might be able to access them. I had to engage with the world in order to find a lot of the different locations the game has, and I think that's what exploration is about. I also really like how they've used caves to connect those areas. In Elden Ring, a cave was a small dungeon leading to a boss and a few rewards, like some upgrade materials and a new weapon or a new talisman. And like I said, that made the cave very predictable. And I say cave, but that's the same for the different forts or catacombs. They were fun because the combat was fun, but exploration-wise they were not the best. Most of that doesn't change in the DLC, but having some of those dungeons leading to new areas of the game makes them a lot more interesting to me. That's not to say Elden Ring doesn't do things like that. There is a cave leading to Limgrave's Dragon Church. Gold Cave also have an exit to Limgrave. A cave in Altus leads to one of the diving tower. The Academy Crystal Cave leads to a self-contained zone in the Academy. But that's the thing. Those caves have an extra exit, but it leads to what feels more like an extra room than a new area. The path to the snowfield goes through a catacomb, but you don't have to explore it. The only moment I think Elden Ring really does something similar to what the DLC did with its cave is with the cave connecting Liurnia to the Altus Plateau, and I think that's one, if not the best, cave of the game. There is also some level of interconnectivity in Elden Ring with the underground locations that connect with the surface at various points. But despite that, the underground feels separated from the rest of the world. They even have their own map. To me, the undergrounds feel like the painted world of Ariamis, a very interesting location in itself, but one that doesn't feel connected to the rest of the game. The only two entrances that feel like interconnectivity between top ground and underground are with the crater in Mistwood and the illusory wall at the bottom of Lendel sewers. I especially love that one because of the parallel to Dark Souls, with a first illusory wall leading to a chest, and behind the chest another illusory wall leading to an area being mainly a lot of roots and branches. Elden Ring also had an area, the plateau above the Albinoric village, that you can see early on and requires you to follow a convoluted path through many other locations in order to be reached. My point is not that Elden Ring didn't do those things, but those moments, that were among the best moments the game had exploration-wise, were very few and far between. My point is that Elden Ring tried to do those things, but wasn't as successful as the DLC. The last thing I want to talk about is the area themes. I've shown some images of the Cerulean Coast just before. It's an area you access after following the river down. You go right, aim for the atoll in the rock. It's uphill, so as you climb, the camera points upward, making it impossible to see what's to come. You start to see a few blue flowers on the ground, and you emerge through the hole, and this is just gorgeous. This is one of the most beautiful places I've seen in any video game. I love that place so much, sometimes I warp here just to contemplate it. This place is not just beautiful, it's also serene. Seeing it put me in a good mood. Just above, you have Caro's Hidden Grave, which has a similar introduction. I don't like the red flowers as much as the blue one, so I don't find that place as beautiful as the Cerulean Coast, but it's as memorable. Just next to those areas, at least on the map, you have the Abyssal Wood with its yellow and orange Halloween flowers, and behind the Shadow Keep you find the Skadu View with the Shaman Village in a bed of flowers. And so, after seeing all those beautiful places, I was left with a question. Why are there no flowers in Elden Ring? When I think about flowers in Elden Ring, the only place that comes to my mind is Windmill Village, with its pink flowers and the people dancing like they were celebrating a wedding or festival. And you explore the place, and they try to murder you. All of that makes it a memorable place, so why didn't they use flowers more? But then I replayed Elden Ring and I realized there were flowers everywhere. Like those are some nice looking blue flowers here. Right from the start we have some nice white flowers and some red flowers here, and look at the third church of Marika. There are plenty of flowers there. You have flowers in Boss Arena or in that graveyard just next to the Windmill Village. I remember spending time in that graveyard trying to figure out what I needed to do to access the invisible tower. How is it that I have forgotten about those beautiful flowers in Elden Ring when I have spent the last 6 months thinking about the ones of the DLC, to the point where I'm making that video trying to get them out of my head? Well, I think the reason is because of how they are used. Sure, the flowers you find in Elden Ring look nice, but it feels like they are mainly here to make the world more realistic. This is a big world with towns and castles, but also countryside and ruins. It makes sense to have flowers in these places. You kind of expect flowers in the countryside, and they are good looking. They make for something interesting to watch when you pass by. In a way, Elden Ring's flowers are part of the background. I've forgotten about the flowers in Malenia's arena despite dying here a lot, as there might be one flower for each one of my deaths. I spent many hours in a few days span in this place and I don't remember the flowers because they are just part of the background. You see them during the cutscene, they look great and they help the cutscene looking great, and then you die and you forget them. On the contrary, the flowers in the DLC are unreal. They don't look realistic at all, but I think that helps them stand out a lot more. They don't feel like part of the background, they define the areas they're in. You may be thinking that yes, okay, Elden Ring doesn't use flowers that way, but areas still have a distinct theme. When you enter Caelid, the sky turns red, the land feels dead and full of mold, you start exploring and find encampments filled with bodies being eaten by big giant dogs and crows. As you go south, you start seeing battles between the local army and those giant beasts, and you finally reach the castle where things seem to be under control, and that works. In that moment, Caelid feels amazing with its own unique atmosphere, working great as conveying the story of that place. But then you find the swamp of Aemonia, and it's the same, but with some fog. And you find Dragon's Barrow, and it's the same, but with a small forest, and it's raining. There are some small differences between those three places, but they all have the same atmosphere, and I think that dilutes that feeling of uniqueness. We have three places with distinct names displayed in big letter on the screen each time we enter them, but they all feel like Caelid. In the same way, I just talked about how I didn't pay attention to the pink flowers in Altus Plateau. A part of that can be explained by the place where we find those flowers looking like the rest of the Altus Plateau. The same way the Aeonia swamp just feels like a swamp in Caelid more than a unique place, the forest with pink flowers has the same autumn ambience with the golden grass and the orange tree leaves and the rest of Altus. And because of that, it doesn't stand out as much as it could have. And listen, I don't want to sound like I'm criticizing Elden Ring level design too much, because I think it is very great in some aspects. I love how you start in Limgrave in what feels like spring, then Liurnia feels more like summer, the Altus Plateau looks like autumn, and the mountain is winter. As we progress in our adventure, the world seasons change, which help us feel that progress. There is an entire chapter of the video that I've cut that was talking about all the very cool design ideas they had for Elden Ring. In many regards, From did an amazing job. In regard to the exploration aspect of the game, I think the areas are too big. Not just because that forces them to reuse content too much, but because the human brain can start to view something as normal really fast. No matter how incredible an area looks, you can only spread it for so long before it loses what makes it incredible. That's going to be very subjective, but there is a point where we are going to get used to a place. And Elden Ring's area felt like that to me. They felt incredible on their big reveal when I entered them for the first time, but when I finished exploring them, the magic was not there anymore. And I'm very confident this is because of their size, because the areas of Shadow of the Erdtree like the Cerulean Coast, which are way smaller, felt incredible during my entire exploration. I mean, at least visually incredible. Like for the reuse content, the moment someone will start being used to an environment is going to be subjective. But the bigger the environment, the longer it's used, the more likely it is that people get used to it. With smaller areas, there is less risk for that to happen because environments are not used as much and also because you get from one to another faster. And that keeps the game more fresh. You are seeing new interesting looking things at an higher rate, which I believe is great for keeping exploration interesting. And I think there is a perfect area to show that in the DLC. The Scada view is an area located in the far north of the DLC. It's separated in two parts, the western part that look like this and the eastern part that look like this. The eastern part looks unique. It's the only place that look like this. It can even be split on two with the flower part on one side of the bridge and the finger part on the other. On the contrary, the western part looks like this place, or this place, or this place, or even this place where the DLC starts. In terms of content, the western part has a unique enemy and the giant door leading to the Chalice. It could have been as memorable as the finger part on the shaman village, but it doesn't because the place reused the same environment you've already seen a lot, and with that, the place doesn't feel as unique as it could have. Which is very easy to notice when the other side of the zone has two completely different parts that feel like it's two different zones altogether. The DLC still have huge areas that feel like the open world, the same way Elden Ring has Skellig, Limgrave or the Altus Plateau, a place more about wandering than exploring. But in the DLC, that area is connected via dungeons or convoluted paths to a lot of smaller areas with unique identities that feels a lot more like traditional levels. Sometimes the level is still part of the open world, kinda, cause you still get back healing when you kill enemies. Sometimes it turns out it's a dungeon where you can use your horse, or with some unique gameplay mechanics. All of that keeps the game more fresh, more memorable, and overall, more interesting to explore. And all of that, I believe, is because the game is smaller. So, as a conclusion, I want to go back to what I've discussed so far. Elden Ring was trying to be a game with a huge emphasis in exploration, but failed in some aspects because of too much reuse content that seems like a direct consequence of the game being so big. It seems they've decided to make something smaller with the DLC in an attempt to solve those issues. Like in Elden Ring, each area had a unique theme, but by being smaller in the DLC, we spend less time in them. On one hand, that prevents us from being too much used to each area's visuals, but also to go from one visual to another more frequently, keeping the game more fresh. Smaller areas also mean you don't need as much content to fill them up, leading to a smaller numbers of caves, forges, mausoleums, and catacombs with only 3 of each. This also reduces the number of boss fights needed, which lead to bosses being reused a lot less. All of which limiting the risk for the DLC to become too repetitive. That's great on its own, but there is a cool side effect at not repeating yourself too much. That allows the moment where you do repeat yourself to mean something. That may sound contentious, but reusing content can be good. It's something that can be done for story reasons, or for the ambience, or for other reasons. It's not necessary just in order to fill up the place. Farum Azula is an area at the end of Elden Ring that's full of dragons. It's like their home. So it makes sense to be attacked by a dragon in that place. I think the game was trying to tell us something with those dragons, but that doesn't really work on me, because first, apart from a secret boss, the main bosses of the place are no dragons. And secondly, because the game had already reused so many dragons in so many occasions and places where they feel copy and paste, that the reused dragon in Farum Azula feels the same. I have been conditioned by the game to see dragon as the ultimate copy and paste content, and because of that, any intent the game developers may had when using those dragons was lost on me. Shadow of the Erdtree has a zone full of dragons that are repeated a lot. When you reach the foot of the jagged peak, you find a dragon. Then you start the ascension and you find a second dragon, and just after there is a third dragon, and finally, the main boss of the place is another dragon. Those dragons are here for a reason. The sequence starts when you find Aigon and get invaded. You explore the cave, kill the scaly boss, and reach the bottom of the mountain where the first dragon is. After killing him, or even before if you skip it, you can go inspect the huge dead dragon body that is impossible to miss. Here, an NPC told you the story of Bale the Dread. I'm not super interested in the lore of those games. I haven't seen Vatividia or other YouTuber video on the DLC, so I might be a little bit off, but basically, Placidusax is the dragon's lord. I mean, it's in his name. At some point, Bale tried to overthrow him to become the new lord of the dragons. He managed to cut one of Placidusax's heads, but the fight ended in a draw, cause Placidusax cut one of Bale's legs, and that forced him to retreat to the jagged peak. After that, the followers of Placidusax were to avenge their leader and start a quest to kill Bale and the dragons that followed him. After learning about that, I started the ascension. As soon as I reached the mountain proper, a storm started to rage, and I soon found the second dragon fight. This time, the dragon was not alone. There were 2, and they were fighting each other. I want to go on a quick tangent here to say there are 3 other dragons in the DLC that are roaming in the open world. The one on Scadualtus is fighting a small army, and when I saw it I was sold. I love when games have different factions of enemies that can fight each other, because then you need to think about what enemy you want to attack first, and the one you want to keep for later. It adds a layer of strategies to fights. But then, the actual fight started, and as soon as I stepped in, everyone focused on me. I was fighting a big-ass dragon that was no pushover, and a small army of dudes that were no pushover either, and the game framerate struggling to keep up with everything. This was the worst fight of the game, like most disappointing moment out of 10. The reason I've gone on that tangent is because those two dragons? They are not friends, and I've got that 1v1v1 fight. Well, at least I think it was, but it's probably more a 1v2, I'm not sure. That fight was super cool because of that unexpected alliance. After the fight I realized the dragon helping me was in fact Aegon, the guy that called for help before. He cut one of his fingers to give to me so I can call for his help against Bale. After that there was a cave with the third dragon, Senesax. It's bigger than the previous ones I think, and he's using red lightning on top of the classic dragon moveset, which made him more dangerous. After killing him I continued my ascension, exited the cave and found myself in an even bigger storm. Lightning striking the floor just next to me, a floor full of dead dragon corpses. I continued my ascension and soon after found Bale's arena for one of the most awesome fights of the DLC. I loved this entire section. I loved the ramping intensity as you go from a menacing sky to some heavy wind to a full-on storm, and the parallel with fights against the bigger and bigger dragons. I especially loved how you fight a dragon wielding red lightning magic just before red lightning gets incorporated in the storm itself. I love that Aegon is involved in the dragon fight without you having to do anything. You don't have to interact with a summon site on the floor, he's just fighting a dragon and you help him and then he cut his own fucking finger, and when you summon it during Bale's fight, it delivers the most insane, over-the-top speech FromSoft ever made.
Solid of scale you might be, foul dragon, but I will riddle with holes your rotten hide. With a hail of harpoons, with every last drop of my being.
I don't think it's as epic as the speeches in Armored Core 6, especially in the mission with the big gun, but it's so much insane. I'm not giving more details about Armored Core 6, by the way, I don't want to spoil it. If you've played it, you know what I'm talking about, and if you haven't played it, you should. Armored Core 6 is really cool. But anyway, this entire sequence worked. The reused dragons not only make sense narratively, they made that sequence such an intense moment, which I think was the intent. And I was able to appreciate that because the game wasn't reusing content all over the place. There is another advantage to making a smaller game. If you need to make less content, then you can spend more time working on that content. The time saved by making smaller areas is time the devs can then spend on other things, like into arranging those areas in a more intricate way, leading to a world full of interconnectivity with caves and catacombs used as connection between places, making them more rewarding. The new areas to explore being the new rewards on top of the usual ones, like weapons and talismans. And with that, caves and catacombs become more interesting to explore. The placement of many zones also allowed the player to see them from a distance very early into the game, even when they are not easily accessible, which can lead players to be interested in reaching them, giving an incentive for exploration. Having less ruined towns around the world allows the devs to give those ruins a more interesting level design, making them far more interesting to explore and avoiding the copy and paste feeling those places had in Elden Ring. Once again, I don't want to make it sound like I'm complaining about Elden Ring too much, because almost every good idea in the DLC was already present in Elden Ring and I loved the game. To me, it feels like the DLC design philosophy was to make it smaller by trimming the fat, and it worked. It worked so much, it even allowed the moment with a lot of reused content to shine. That is not to say Shadow of the Erdtree is perfect as it is. I think the DLC lacks more enemy variety. As much as I love the Cerulean Coast, I think the area suffers from not having any unique enemies. Considering the place has a lot of what look like giant boat tombstones, which evoke Viking stuff to me, and considering Dark Souls 3 DLC had enemies that look like Vikings, I think they could have changed them a bit visually and reused them and they would have fit. Maybe they could even have a big ship on the shore to explore. And I think the same for Karo's Grave and most of the DLC, it lacks some more enemies unique to each area. Two areas that had some unique enemies are the Finger Ruins. Those dudes look like some baby version of the Elden Beast to me. I don't know, I think they share some similarities and they fit well in those Finger Ruins. But I think those ruins needed a boss. Blowing the finger whistle only to get rewarded a talisman felt anticlimactic. Considering the boss you unlock after blowing the two-finger whistle is an amalgamation of hands, maybe each ruin can have had one weird-ass hand as a boss, and then Metyr could have been the combination of those hands with their combined movesets, kinda like the Valkyrie in God of War 2018. I don't think the 3 forges we explore in the game should have a boss. I explored one very early on in the DLC, and I was glad there was no boss. If I had to choose between no boss or the same boss repeated in each forge, I would go for no boss at all. I don't think dungeons need to have a boss every time, the same way bosses don't always need a dungeon beforehand. But I think we could have had one boss after exploring the 3 forges. In each one you interact with an altar at the end to get the loot. Interacting with the 3 could have awakened a huge blacksmith boss or something somewhere on the map. I think that could have been cool. But other than that, honestly, I don't really have much more to complain about. Well, allowing player to explore Mesmer Castle from the flooded area first and reach the Golden Hippo from the back door, but then not letting player enter from that side again if they die was funny, yes, but also pretty dumb. And yes, that happened to me. Anyway, this video is about not reusing content too much or being too big, so I think it's time for me to stop. Shadow of the Erdtree may not be perfect, but I think it managed to solve the biggest issue Elden Ring had. It managed to avoid the reuse content issue. And it managed to do it without sacrificing exploration. I would even say it makes that part of the game's experience even better. I don't know what kind of game From Software are going to make next. I don't know if it's going to be another open world, but if it is, I hope they will focus more on the same approach they've taken with the DLC. I don't need a new game with hundreds of locations that look the same. When they are as good as the one in Shadow of the Erdtree, just a few are already enough.